Hi, good afternoon. I am Dilip Jeste from University of California, San Diego. I am very sorry that I cannot be there in person with you, but I am happy that I can talk to you through this video. I want to compliment Angel and Gwen and other colleagues for putting together this outstanding ICGP conference in Seville. I really wish I could be there. As many of you know, ICGP is close to my heart. I was a founding president for 3 years, and I have never missed an ICGP meeting until this time. I'm sure that this is going to be a very successful meeting. I also want to thank Angel for inviting me to be on the honorific committee of the ICGP. It's indeed a privilege to be on that committee. So today I'm going to talk about positive psychiatry and neuroscience. And since ICGP is predominantly geriatric psychoneuropharmacology, I'll be talking more about positive psychiatry of aging or positive geriatric psychiatry and neuroscience. First, in terms of disclosures, I have no financial relationship with the pharmaceutical industry. In my talk, I'm going to begin with successful brain aging or successful mental aging. What is it? Next, I will discuss positive psychological traits, mainly resilience, optimism, and social engagement. Next, I will describe some of our own work in the area of wisdom. Next, I will talk about the neurobiology of positive psychological traits, mainly focusing on resilience and wisdom. And finally, I'll talk about the implications for interventions in this area. So what is positive psychiatry or positive geriatric psychiatry? Psychiatry has traditionally been considered a branch of medicine that is focused on treatment of people with mental illnesses. And that will always be an important focus for psychiatry. However, I think the scope of psychiatry should be broader than that. A number of studies in the rest of medicine have shown that positive psychological traits like resilience, optimism, social engagement are associated with not only better mental health but also better physical health and even longevity. That's why I believe that psychiatry, including psychiatry of aging, should also focus on these positive psychological traits, studies of these traits, as well as clinical application of appropriate intervention to people with mental illnesses as well as people with physical illnesses. This idea of positive psychiatry started several years ago at UCSD. Over the past 25 years or so, we have been studying schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders in middle-aged and older people. We have had an NIH-funded center for a number of years. The usual notion about schizophrenia since the times of Kraepelin is that it is a degenerating disease. That's why Kraepelin called it dementia praecox. So the idea is that schizophrenia follows a progressively downhill course. And yet, in our studies, we have not found that to be the case. We have found that the course of schizophrenia in later life is stable and even non-deteriorating. Not only that, but with aging, there is improvement in psychotic symptoms. improvement in treatment adherence, and there are fewer psychiatric relapses in older people with schizophrenia. These findings have also been shown by several other investigators, including some in Europe. In a recent study, we found that the physical health in people with schizophrenia declines with age, as occurs in normal people, but the mental health does not. Look at this slide. This was a paper that we published in Schizophrenia Research. This is a study of a scale called SF36, short form 36. It's the most widely used scale for health-related functioning and quality of well-being. It has two components, physical and mental. The red line shows the physical component, and what we see here is that there seems to be decline in physical health with aging. That's to be expected. What is unexpected is what happens to mental health. That's the blue line. It seems to improve with aging, and this is in people with schizophrenia. So one question was, is this something that is unique to our population of schizophrenia, or is this a more general phenomenon in terms of improvement in mental health with aging? So we started a study of seniors who are living in the community. We excluded people in the nursing homes, but everybody else we included in our study, and we have included more than 3,000 people in this work, which involves a survey questionnaire that has number of rating scales for physical health, mental health, including depression, exercise, various other activities, medical illnesses, medications, etc. We also have scales for positive psychological traits like resilience, optimism, and so on. In addition, we asked one question: where do you rate yourself on successful aging on a scale from 1 to 10? 1 is the worst, 10 is the best. We did not tell our subjects how to define successful aging. We told them to use their own definition and just tell us where they rank themselves on that 1 to 10 scale. These people range in age from 60 to 102. Only 18% of these people would have met physical criteria for successful aging. In other words, only 18% people were free of diseases and disabilities. In other words, 82% of our sample had some kind of physical illness: arthritis, diabetes, hypertension, heart disease, some even had cancer. So 82% of these people would not have met criteria for physically successful aging. They also had the usual psychosocial stressors. Many of them had lost their spouse. Some of them had lost their children. Financially, some of them had difficulties. So these were people, the average seniors. So these were not supernormal centenarians, but the average type senior with physical and psychosocial problems that we all see. So what kind of a rating on successful aging would they give themselves on a scale from 1 to 10? Again, 1 is the worst, 10 is the best. This is what we found. We found that most of these people gave themselves 7, 8, 9, or even 10. The average rating was 8.4. So something strange was going on, that on the one hand, these were people with physical disabilities, diseases, and yet they thought that they were aging well. And it is not only that they thought they were aging well, but they actually were functioning well in a psychosocial sense. Most of them were living independently. They had positive adaptation, active engagement with life, sense of mastery, growth, life satisfaction, and cognitive function appropriate for their age. The significant associations of this self-rated successful aging as well as better psychosocial functioning were three types: attitudes, health, and activities. In terms of attitudes, the subjective successful aging and psychosocial successful aging was associated with higher levels of optimism, resilience, self-efficacy, positive attitude toward aging, and low level of perceived stress. Everybody has stress, but the successful agers were less overwhelmed by the stress than other people. In terms of health, one of the best predictors was absence of depression. Finally, activity is very important, and these included physical activities, any kind of exercise. Even for people in wheelchairs, they could throw beach ball to one another. That was a physical activity. In terms of cognitive activities, reading, writing, listening to radio, even using computer to exchange pictures of their grandkids, and socialization with friends. The drawback of this study that I mentioned so far is that it's a sample of convenience. So you could argue that these are people who are already doing well. For one thing, it's the survivor cohort. These are people who already have lived into old age, and these people selected themselves to participate in the study because they were doing well. To control for that bias, we have started a new study in which the sample is randomly selected. So instead of taking a sample of convenience, we have chosen a randomly selected sample. What we did was we contracted with a survey company, something like Gallup, a smaller version. They had access to millions of phone numbers. They randomly selected 1,300 people between the ages of 50 and 100 in whom they completed a telephone interview for half an hour. And this telephone interview included cognitive assessment. So we use a technique called structured multi-cohort longitudinal design. It's developed by my statistician colleague Wes Thompson in collaboration with Ruth O'Hara at Stanford. And we then use random digit dialing to select a random sample. So this is a sample between the ages of 50 and 100, and we intentionally oversampled people in their 80s and 90s. The telephone interview was followed by survey questionnaire, which people completed at home and then mailed it to us. We are also collecting saliva samples from these people where we have extracted the DNA, and we are going to look at some of the candidate genes. And finally, we are following these people annually. I just want to show you some brief data. The first paper based on this study is in press in American Journal of Psychiatry. In terms of self-rated successful aging, again we find that most of these people gave themselves 7, 8, 9 or 10, very similar to what you saw in our earlier sample of convenience. The cognitive testing that we did as a part of the phone interview, you see that there is some decline with cognitive functioning with age. This is to be expected. As we age, working memory, some of the learning abilities, psychomotor speed, they go down. So some normal age-related cognitive decline is inevitable. We then use a scale, the same one that I talked earlier in people with schizophrenia, SF-36, which has two components, physical and mental. So the physical component, again as expected, you see that there seems to be a decline with age. But look at the mental component. It does not decline. As a matter of fact, it seems to improve a little bit in later life. Even more striking is this slide. So this broken green line shows percentage of people with no disability. So in the beginning, you see the people between 50 and 60 years of age. You see that more than 60% of them are free of disability. By the time you reach the other end, 90 plus, fewer than 10% are free of disability. So the proportion of people who are free of disability declines from age 50 to 100. Again, this is as we would expect with age. What is interesting is what happens to self-rated successful aging. It seems to go in the opposite direction. As people get older, their functioning, self-rated successful aging actually improves. So the summary of this data is that there is what I call paradox of aging. On the one hand, physical health declines with age, some cognitive abilities decline with age, and yet self-rated successful aging, mental health, psychosocial functioning tend to improve with age. And the main associations of this psychosocially successful aging are positive psychological traits such as resilience, optimism, which do not decline with age but stay stable and may even increase with age in some people. But of course, there is heterogeneity. Not everybody ages successfully. Many people do, but not all people, not all of them. So I want to say a few words now about some of the data on resilience, optimism, and social engagement. In an earlier paper, we looked at resilience. What is resilience? Resilience is the ability to adapt positively to adversity or stresses. We use a scale called Connor-Davidson scale. This has been fairly widely used and validated scale for resilience. There's a part of the survey that we gave to about 1,400 postmenopausal women. The significant correlates of resilience were higher emotional well-being, optimism, self-rated successful aging, social engagement, and fewer cognitive complaints. So it looked like higher levels of resilience were associated with better overall psychosocial functioning. Other studies have shown that resilience is also associated with better physical health and greater longevity. In terms of optimism, there have been several studies of optimism in relationship to physical and mental health. I just want to talk about one study. This was a Dutch study of 545 men aged 64 to 45 who had no cardiovascular disease or cancer at baseline, and then these people were followed over the next 15 years. These investigators also gave a survey similar to ours, which included a scale for optimism. They divided these subjects into 3 tertiles. So in this slide you see this is a survival curve. The outcome measure being death from cardiovascular disease over a 15-year period. The uppermost tertile reflects people who are most optimistic. The lowest tertile reflects people who are most pessimistic. What the investigators found was that people in the highest optimism tertile had 1/2 the mortality as people in the least optimistic tertile over a 15-year period from cardiovascular diseases. 50% difference in longevity. This was a well-done study, so they looked at and controlled for factors like past history of any kind of cardiovascular disease, family history of heart disease, use of statins, smoking, exercise, diet, etc. But this is really a significant difference that is related to optimism in terms of cardiovascular mortality. Finally, regarding social engagement, I just want to show you results from one paper that was very recently published. This was a meta-analysis of 148 studies of social engagement. Total sample size, combined sample size, was more than 300,000 people from various age groups, both genders, different conditions. The investigators found that people with strong social engagement had 50% greater survival than people with weak social engagement over the study period. And these findings were consistent across age, gender, initial health status, cause of death, and follow-up period. So, social engagement rivals the effect of well-established health risk factors like smoking, hypertension, obesity, sedentary lifestyle. So, what this shows is that things like resilience, optimism, social engagement are critically important not just for mental health, but also for physical health and longevity. One other positive psychological trait on which there has been much less research, especially from the neuroscience side, is wisdom. This slide shows the changes in different cognitive abilities with age. This was a review done by Etienne Sibyl and colleagues at Pittsburgh. You see that most cognitive abilities shown in the blue, green, and similar lines, they decline with age. There are a few that do not decline. There's a slight improvement, but mainly stability in later life. They mainly relate to vocabulary. But one question we asked was, is there anything that actually improves significantly with age? Why would we think of that? This is Dr. Montalcini, an Italian scientist who got Nobel Prize in Medicine back in 1986. She recently celebrated her 100th birthday, and she said that my mind is sharper today than when I was 20. And yet, she of course has the usual physical illnesses. She has usual difficulties with remembering names and faces, and yet she felt that overall her mind was sharper. Another Nobel laureate, Eric Kandel, psychiatrist and neuroscientist at University of Columbia, at Columbia University in New York. He's now 81, and he said that I think I do science better now than when I was younger. Judgment is so important, and now I have a better judgment and better understanding of which problems are important and which are not. So, what these people are talking about is that wisdom. Wisdom is an ancient religious and philosophical concept, but rather ignored in empirical sciences. There is hardly any research on wisdom until about 1970. In 1970s, there were about 15 papers on wisdom that we found in a search using on PubMed. Most of the studies came from the field of gerontology, psychology, and sociology. That number has gone up. In the last decade, there have been more than 350 papers with wisdom in the title. But again, most of this literature is in gerontology, psychology, sociology, very little in psychiatry and neurosciences. So what is wisdom? We started with a review of literature that has been published in the last 40 years. Several of these papers have used definitions. So what we did, wisdom is of course not a single thing, it has different components. So what we did was to put these definitions side by side and try to find out which components are common to several of these definitions. We found 6 components that were common to these definitions. These were pragmatic knowledge of life or social decision making, emotional regulation, pro-social attitudes and behaviors, things like compassion, empathy, altruism, things that we do for others rather than for ourselves. Then reflection or self-understanding. It is knowing yourself, insight. Next, dealing effectively with uncertainty and ambiguity. Most situations in life are not black and white, they are gray, and still we have to be decisive. And lastly, tolerance of different value system. So these were the elements that we found were common to several modern scientific definitions of wisdom. But one criticism of the concept of wisdom is that it is cultural, that different cultures define wisdom differently, so it is really not a standard universal construct. To see if that was true, we wanted to look at wisdom in a very different document, and that document was the Gita, the Bhagavad Gita. This is, if you will, this is the Hindu Bible. This was written several thousand years BC. So what we did was we did a study in consultation with a medical anthropologist. So this was a qualitative, quantitative mixed method study. We looked at two translations of Gita, looking at the context in which the word wisdom or its synonyms as well as antonyms such as folly or foolishness were used. What we found was that the elements of or components of wisdom that were included in the Gita were general knowledge of life, emotional regulation, pro-social attitudes and behaviors such as compassion, empathy, sacrifice, knowing yourself, insight, humility, and decisiveness, acting in the face of uncertainty. So you'll remember that these are exactly the first 5 components that I described in my slide earlier, that is based on the modern Western definition of wisdom. So it is remarkable that the way wisdom was defined in a document written thousands of years ago in an entirely different part of the world, that definition is so similar to the modern Western definition, which is largely based on the Greek philosophers' thinking, such as Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. There are a few differences. Gita is a religious document, so it talks about love of God as a component of wisdom. Also, like most Eastern cultures, there is a lack of emphasis on materialistic pursuits in contrast to the modern Western concepts. Nonetheless, it is the similarities that are striking. So what do the similarities mean? One possibility is that the similarities mean that the concept of wisdom is not purely cultural. It is predominantly or primarily a biological construct. If it is biological, we would expect that it would not change over a period of centuries, and it would not change across geographic boundaries. So if it is biologically based, obviously it would be based in the brain. So the question is, where in the brain is wisdom located? I started by showing you the slide that showed that many cognitive abilities decline with age. Some stay relatively stable, like vocabulary, and the question asked was, is there any cognitive ability or abilities that actually improve significantly with age? And I suggested that maybe it is wisdom. Is there evidence that wisdom increases with aging? There are actually some empirical data suggesting that is the case. Baltis and Baltis from Max Planck Institute have shown that new learning is possible and older adults continue to exhibit new forms of adaptive capacity. Similarly, we and other groups have shown that aging is associated with greater happiness, better mental health, better management of interpersonal relationships. And there are a couple of some very interesting recent studies in the proceedings of National Academy of Sciences, which showed that components of wisdom such as social reasoning and decision making actually improve with age. So there is some evidence that wisdom increases with aging. We published a commentary in JAMA a couple of years ago in which we made an argument that wisdom actually may have an evolutionary role. Humans have the longest aging period in the entire animal world. The physical aging starts at least at age 20, if not earlier. Cognitive aging starts at least at age 40, if not earlier. And yet, the average lifespan today is over 80, and the maximum lifespan is 120. And typically, the old age in humans is associated with declining physical ability, decline in most of the cognitive abilities. The fertility declines markedly after menopause or climacteric. So, from the evolutionary point of view, human aging does not make sense. It is not conducive to either survival of self or survival of species. So the idea is that something must improve with aging that compensates for these declines in physical and cognitive health. And we propose that that is wisdom. That increase in wisdom may have survival value for the self, because wisdom with associated improved social functioning, emotional regulation, etc., would help one to navigate the social system better, for better care of self. At the same time, it may also have value for the species survival. There is something called grandma hypothesis. That is, the grandparents can transmit wisdom to their grandkids, which the parents cannot. So, wisdom and increase in wisdom with aging may actually have survival value for self and species. And so, increase in wisdom with aging may actually make sense. I want to spend now a few minutes talking about neurobiology of these positive psychological traits. Very briefly about the genetics of successful aging itself. Several years ago, my colleague Steve Glatt and the rest of us, we published a review of genetics of successful aging. We looked at studies in which people had looked at genetic markers of longevity plus one other marker of successful aging. There is cognitive aging, psychosocial aging, whatever, but some marker of successful aging. And this literature is obviously limited. Nonetheless, we found that 6 genes were associated with successful aging in 2 or more studies. They include the ApoE, as you would expect, and some others like JesteTalk, a couple of interleukins, 6 and 10, and sirtuins, especially sirtuin 3. At the same time, it is clear that genes don't account for all of successful aging. Behavior and environment are also critical. In terms of positive psychological traits, there has been quite a bit of literature and studies in terms of resilience. Over the last 15 years, Eric Nestler, Dennis Charney, and others have outlined the neurocircuitry of wisdom as well as genetics and molecular biology of resilience. I want to say neurocircuitry of resilience and genetics and molecular biology of resilience. What they have shown is that several specific genes seem to be associated with resilience, but the behavior also affects the expression of those genes. A very nice review of neurobiology of resilience that was published in Nature Reviews Neurosciences. For the last few years, we have been focusing on neurobiology of wisdom. As I said earlier, it looks like the definition of wisdom has been reasonably stable across cultures and over long periods of time, which suggests that it probably has a neurobiological basis. So we wanted to find out if there is something like neurocircuitry of wisdom. Now, how do you decide which areas of the brain are involved in wisdom? Many of you are familiar with this figure that shows Brodmann's areas. So this brain architecture is divided into certain areas, and each area has a functional significance. For example, area 4, the back of the frontal region, is a motor area. How do we know it is a motor area? One way is that if you damage this area 4 in animals, there is paralysis of limbs. There may be hemiplegia or paraplegia. In humans, those who have, say, hemiplegia or paraplegia, you will find brain lesions in the area 4. So, by looking at the damage to specific areas and their consequences, one can figure out the functionality of different areas. So, we asked a question, are there specific areas of the brain whose damage is associated with loss of wisdom? We didn't find any studies that specifically address this question. However, there has been literature that looked at the consequences of damage to specific areas and its results in terms of things such as social reasoning, emotional regulation, insight, pro-social behaviors, decisiveness. So the components of wisdom were associated with damage to certain areas. Let me just give you a couple of examples. I think most of you in this room are familiar with Phineas Gage, one of the best known persons in the neuroscience area. He was a construction worker in Vermont in the mid-19th century. He was described as a nice man, smart man, wise man. One day, there was a bizarre accident, and a large iron rod went through the back of his left eye, came through the top of his head. Miraculously, he survived. Even more miraculously, he had practically no neurological deficit and relatively few neurocognitive deficits. The main effect was on his personality. This is the description of Phineas Gage after the injury given by his personal physician. He became, after this accident, fitful, irreverent, profane, non-differential, impatient, obstinate, capricious, vacillating, devising, childish. Friends who knew him for a long time said that he was no longer the Gage that he knew. There have been studies of where exactly was the damage to his skull. These are studies published in Science. They showed that the damage was more or less restricted to the left prefrontal region. There have been about a dozen cases like Phineas Gage that have been described since then. Some of the more recent studies have used brain imaging, cognitive neuropsychological testing, etc. And based on these studies, we found out that certain regions of the brain seem to be consistently associated with what looked like loss of wisdom. Because if you look at this description of Gage, it is the exact antithesis of wisdom. There is also a disease which most of you are familiar with, frontotemporal dementia. This is a dementia that occurs somewhat earlier in life than Alzheimer's, usually in the 50s. And memory loss is a much later manifestation of this. The main change that occurs in frontotemporal dementia is one in personality. Usual symptoms are poor social decision making, loss of personal and social awareness, loss of inhibition, impulsivity, that is lack of emotional regulation, antisocial personality, instead of prosocial is antisocial, lack of empathy, emotional coldness, apathy, poor insight, self-centeredness. Again, exact antithesis of wisdom. And the damage in some variants of prefrontotemporal dementia is more or less restricted to the prefrontal region. So based on this various literature, we have proposed that the neurocircuitry of wisdom involves the prefrontal cortex, the dorsolateral, ventromedial, and anterior cingulate, as well as amygdala. The prefrontal cortex is the newest area of the brain from evolutionary perspective, whereas the amygdala and limbic striatum is the oldest area of the brain. So in other words, wisdom may involve balance of the oldest and newest parts of the brain. At this stage, this is an hypothesis. It is a heuristic hypothesis that people can prove wrong. Nonetheless, what we want to do is really get the field interested and have the neuroscience research expand in this area. I talked earlier about how wisdom can increase with aging. But how can anything like this improve with aging? When I went to medical school, I was taught that most of the growth and development of the brain occurred in utero and in the first few years of life. From 20 to 60, the brain was pretty stable, and from 60, it was all downhill. Recent research has shown that that's not the case. We published a couple of reviews of both structural and functional imaging in relationship to successful cognitive aging. And what we found was that in the studies, better cognitive functioning in later life was associated with larger brain structure and stronger connections. Now, of course, we don't know whether this meant that people with larger structures and stronger connections have better cognitive functioning, or the people whose cognitive functioning improves, their brains, specific brain structures grow larger and the connections become stronger. So we don't know really either the causality or the longitudinal changes. So clearly studies of that kind are needed. The most exciting is the last part, continued synaptogenesis and neurogenesis. Studies have shown that not only synapses but even neurons increase in certain parts of the brain like dentate gyrus of the hippocampus and periventricular area in older age if there is adequate physical and psychosocial stimulation. And this has been shown in multiple species. Finally, the implications of all these for interventions. There are strategies for successful aging such as calorie restriction, more physical activity, superfood that are rich in antioxidants. There are also some data showing that positive psychological traits contribute to improved functioning. Some studies at Yale by Levy and colleagues showed that negative attitude toward aging was associated with greater cardiovascular response to stress. In other words, positive attitude was associated with less cardiovascular response to stress. In another study, these researchers found that positive attitude toward aging was associated with 7.5 year survival advantage. Finally, in one randomized controlled trial, these researchers found that introducing positive attitude toward aging resulted in reduced biological cardiovascular response to stress. What about wisdom and aging in terms of interventions? There is some very interesting work going on right now, supported by MacArthur Foundation. This kind of a social experiment that's called experience score. What these folks are doing is to take some seniors in the community over the age of 65 who agree to spend at least 15 hours a week working in elementary schools in downtowns. These are kids who typically don't have grandparents. Some of them don't even have parents. So these seniors, they spend time, I said at least 15 hours a week with these kids. And what has been found is that over this period, the kids' performance in the school improves significantly. What is interesting is that the seniors' quality of well-being also improves, and their level of wisdom also goes up. So it's a great example of intergenerational work that is mutually beneficial. So bring us back to the positive psychiatry of aging. We propose in a recent editorial in the British Journal of Psychiatry that there should be a new model of positive psychiatry of aging, in which we focus not only on symptom relief for people with mental illnesses, but we also focus on recovery, promotion of successful aging, neuroplasticity of aging, prevention, and interventions to enhance positive psychological traits like resilience, social engagement, and wisdom. This should be useful not only for mental illnesses, but also for physical illnesses. And so this new model of positive psychiatry will be at the center of not only mental health care, but really the entire health care, including physical. It's clearly more clinical neurobiological intervention research in this area is urgently needed. Thank you for your attention, and thank you for this opportunity to talk to you through this video. I wish you all a very successful conference, and I hope to see you all very soon. Thank you.